Everybody hear me? I could probably talk the whole room out without the mic on, but I'll go ahead and get started. So we'll start out, think about a situation. You've been in a long incident that has gone all day and into the night. It's now 2 a.m., and another engineer is stepping in to take over. As soon as that engineer joins the call and checks into the incident, what do? Do you immediately hop off the call and check out for the night, saying, hey, hope the best for you? Or do you stay on, exchange some information, help the engineer come up to speed that's coming in to step in, to take over? Or C, do you just say, I don't know, this isn't a situation I've considered before? So we'll kind of look at those and try to answer those questions of where we would be. So hey everyone, I'm Todd. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, as Alex said, Handover communications and software operations. It's actually findings from the field, so there's research behind this. And we'll talk a little bit about the various research as we get into this. A little bit about me. Been in tech for more than 20 years, currently at CrowdStrike as SRE manager. So a little bit about the two items here, the Abilene University and Lund. So a friend used to tease me about it, that I don't advertise my MBA, so this is the one time I'll do it. So yes, I got that early on in my career. But then my most recent accomplishment is graduating from Lund in 2022 in the Human Factors and System Safety program at the university. So, but before I get started, can I get a show of hands of whether your organization or past organization you've actually worked in had some form of handover communications? Most organizations call them handoffs, in a sense. You might do this on call or in other situations. Lots of show of hands. So this will be hopefully interesting to you. So this is the start of my journey. The picture here, it's in the kitchen table at my home. And it was a year-long journey. As you can see, everything's pretty tidy for the most part. My computer's charged and ready to go. So we can kind of start this journey off and let's do it. So first, the definition of handover communications. This is taken from the Joint Commission. That's more in the healthcare space, but it actually fit well with my research. It's a transfer and acceptance of responsibility achieved through effective communication. It's a real-time process of passing specific information from one person to another or from one team of persons to another for the purpose of ensuring the continuity and safety of work situations. So that's how we'll define it as we go forth. So let's have a brief history of handover communications. So late 1990s, NASA actually granted two individuals some grants to do some research in it. This is Dr. David Woods and Dr. Emily Patterson. Emily Patterson's most known for her work in handover communications. A little bit about the research in NASA is they were essentially looking at, as an operator comes into a situation, high stakes, high tempo situation, how fast can they come up to speed with the current operator? And then they would actually spend, the two operators would spend about an hour together, and then the other operator that was currently there would leave, and the new operator would come in and have that as part of their shift change. So that took off there. That was the first time they started looking at it, and that was really what Emily Patterson's dissertation and dissertation was for her doctorate. And so then further research kind of gained steam. You started seeing research in nuclear power generations by these folks as well, railroad dispatchers and ambulance dispatchers. That all started it. And then Dr. Emily Patterson entered healthcare. With that, it grew in popularity. To give you kind of popularity that resonates with this is, during my research, there's about 5,000 plus papers just on healthcare. I didn't go through them all. I did sift through them for specific keywords and things like that. But at the time, in circa 2017, what I had found is there was about 4,000 plus handovers occurring in healthcare per day. You can imagine what it is today. So kind of keep that in mind. And then also in 2022, this is kind of where it stems from as I did all this research prior, I said, well, software operations doesn't have any type of research behind it regarding handover communications and software operations, and we do it all the time. We do it from on-call to network operations centers to customer support. I've even heard recently from folks around onboarding new customers and doing that handover with them and things like that. So it's been quite an interesting journey with handover communications and the history behind it. So there's really two types of handover communications as part of this research. There's verbal handover communications, quite common. It's two people basically exchanging information, mainly subjectively. and then also digitally written communications. I'll spend a little time here for a second. So that is really using a digital communications platform. It could be Slack, it could be Microsoft Teams, companies use WhatsApp as well. So those are kind of the two types. A bonus here is kind of going back, before we had digitized services and these abilities with these digital platforms, it was really written handover communications with the other type as well. Mainly healthcare started that piece too, where they would just go around to like in the ICU and basically talk about each individual patient. So with that, they would use written handover communications. So that's kind of the two forms of handover communications that we have to look at. So the area of research I spent most of my time investigating was with engineers' confidence in the information exchange after the handover. Hence, it's how they're related. So handover communications and confidence and how they relate to each other as part of the research. And as we dive into it, there'll be some things to look at. So really the question we're going to look at is, what are the key attributes that contribute to how confident software engineers are with understanding the current state of the system after a handover in software operations is completed? So, departmental background. So where did I do the research? Where did I look into the research? So first was Network Operations Center. They also had a shift and an on-call situation. So they operate around the clock. They perform incident resolution and communications, both for internal applications to the company and external for incidents. And then pre-pandemic, they did verbal handovers in person. Pandemic current, digitally written via Slack workflows. But we're going to talk about how they got here a little bit later in the presentation. Customer Support Center operates around the clock, resolves customer-facing questions and application problems. During the research, they did informal handovers initially, just real quick DMs. Then they moved to a more formally digitally written handovers via DMs. And that's their current, that's what we have today. We'll talk about more of that later too as well. So what methodology and methods that I used? So I'll say the word inspired by phonemology. What's that really defined as? It's really illuminating individual experiences or these lived experiences that these engineers would have in their everyday work and normal work, and gaining their perspectives of the individuals of each situation. Part of that too, I conducted semi-structured interviews. We talk about that in incident analysis you've heard today around those interviews and they're flexible and whatnot. That's what semi-structured interviews allowed me to do, is once the actual departments had their handover, I would essentially tap them on the shoulder and go into Zoom and have an informal conversation with them with some semi-structured interview questions built out. And then I use that so I could then be flexible in allowing the conversation to flow in various ways, in various directions that the engineers wanted to go. And it actually is the way I gained insights into that research. So the framework. So this is the framework really are really the concepts used in the research that I went down the path of. So the concepts are joint activity, common ground, adaptive capacity, we've heard that a lot today, and confidence. So what is joint activity? So in joint tech, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but it really depends on its interpredictability of participants' attitudes and actions within an activity that they're doing jointly. The big piece of a joint activity is this idea of a basic compact, and really it's between two participants in an agreement set forth where both parties will actually participate in that activity and will carry out those responsibilities both in coordinating and communicating. So we talked about incident commanders today, incident coordination, incident analysis, and all those together. This is somewhat the academic terms around joint activity that we look at. Those things happen and we don't think about them. What is common ground? So common ground, and this is Gary Klein. There's a paper out there from my thesis that is referenced, but it's really common ground supports interdependent actions through participants having mutual set of beliefs, assumptions, and knowledge, which are important to establish common ground. So you want to have common ground, obviously, with joint activity. Hence why it was important with handler communications. You're doing that all the time between two individuals or two teams, trying to transfer information over through an information exchange. There's a big proponent of this, though. There's common ground breakdown. What is common ground breakdown? It really is a party where a party defects or participant defects from the joint activity. However, the other party on the other side is believing that the basic compact is still intact. and that the understanding is that the common ground is still being established. So that can happen, especially in digital written communications, because you're having this conversation, but how do you know that other person on the other end isn't checking their cooking, got kids coming in, whatever may be going on. So they may be there, but they may not be there. So we'll look at that a little bit more. What is adaptive capacity? So we've heard this a lot, adaptive capacity. A little backstory. So I was going to use resilience in the research. It was actually told to me from the professors and some outside experts to not use resilience because it is hyper popular. And so adaptive capacity is the journey that I took. And it's really this potential for adjusting patterns of activities to handle future changes in kinds of events, opportunities, and disruptions. It's really experienced, these adaptive capacities exist before changes and disruptions call upon those capacities. So it's really already there. This is, again, Dr. David Wood's, I actually quote it there. It's Revisiting Resilience, Essentials for Resilience is where it comes from in his paper. So what is confidence? This is a subjective topic. It was hard to find in the research. Really around user experience is where I found most of my information. So confidence is described as the belief and feeling about the abilities or qualities of somebody or something. Confidence is a skill that can be acquired and improved over time. The big piece I took out of it, though, that I went down with my journey is it's not all encompassing. There's increased confidence in some areas, and then there can be decreased confidence in some areas. It just depends on the situation at hand. So it's very subjective on how an engineer would feel confident after a handover occurs, whether it was good or not, or satisfactory, unsatisfactory, which we'll talk more about. So now that we have the history, definition, types, how handover communications and confidence relate, departmental backgrounds, methodology and methods, and framework defined, let's peek in to see how the journey is actually progressing at the time. So you can see from the photo, at this point I'm muddling through, there's messy details. This is essentially my brain at the time. There's like books not shown. I know some of them, you might catch on Working Minds there. There's a few books there too as well. There's really a method in my madness, and it's just really, at this point, my brain just kind of going in all different directions at this time. So next we're going to talk about the themes that were accumulated after going, that emerged from this analysis and interviews that I did. Prior to this, there's like coding analysis that we do, but and data analysis I did before getting to the themes, but really that's what we'll focus on. So I'm going to take a drink 1 second here. Okay, all right. So the first theme, organizational context of handover communications. So what does that entail? So engineers experience with different types of handovers. So with this, what I found gaining insights and interviews is these different types of handovers, the main form of handover communications in the organization was all digitally written handover communications. However, the engineers specifically always said, well, I really prefer verbal, but they never got on a call or anything like that they did. So they really preferred it because they feel like they were vocal learners. And if you're a vocal learner, that's what they preferred. And a lot of the engineers I talked with, that's what they preferred. So that kind of stemmed from that. Another one was reports of inconsistent communications. So engineers reported that they struggled or had difficulties with inconsistencies from department to department about what information was needed for the handover. So thinking these network operations center and customer support centers are very, there's individual departments underneath them, and they all had their different ways of doing things. And so it was really difficult and cognitive load heavy on the actual engineers trying to understand what they needed to communicate as part of their handover. So here we're going to look at what an engineer says. This is what they say. From the experience I have, I think even as bubble gum and toothpick built as our handoffs are, it's still a lot more solid than handoffs that I've seen in other departments, mainly because they appear to be inconsistent. For example, inconsistent handoffs exist when transitioning from one commander to another, and I don't know who the new commander is. I'll be working with them as the communications lead. So the engineer is actually giving feedback to me around their view of how the handoffs are. I think it's important to look at bubble, gum, and toothpick built as our handoffs are. That's the way they felt about theirs. But they were looking across other departments and saying, well, ours is better than theirs. So they were kind of distancing themselves from it. But it's kind of interesting what engineers had to say about that in their perspectives. Evolving handover communications. So, continuous improvement. I know it's obvious. Oh, yeah, we talk about continuous improvement all the time in our industries, in our companies, and whatnot. But one piece I want to talk about here is why continuous improvement came up is because of what happened in the Network Operations Center. So what happened in that world was they were, like I said, they were verbal initially in the office. Then March hits. They're now all of a sudden remote. March 11th, 2020, March 11th. That's my mom's birthday, that's why I remember that. That happens then. So then they're going into this realm of being remote, so then they just start doing informal DMs. Well, then they aren't capturing everything, and they don't feel like they have enough detail. So then the head of the Network Operations Center, who I talked with, basically said, okay, well, we did this blog. They did this huge blog of all the information and did a big brain dump each handover that occurred between two engineers. Well, then the engineer that was incoming was like, I'm exhausted, that's just too much information. So then they found, oh, we got Slack and we got this workflow capability, so let's go leverage that. And so then they iterated and they started using Slack workflows, and then they also actually had an acknowledge button they put with it. We'll get into that a little bit later. And they also emojied it a little bit too, so with Slack. So that's where they landed and where they currently were. So that's kind of how they continuously improved on their handover communications, because just because you have it good once, you need to continue to look at it. So it was evolving handover communications at the time. So the next one is information exchange emerged from all this. Like, it feels obvious, but it isn't. One piece of that is coming up to speed. So what's that really mean? So coming up to speed is this idea that you're exchanging information, but you're trying to help the engineer that's incoming up to speed as fast as possible with the most detailed information that you have at the current time. And that can be difficult at times. And so that was one thing that engineers felt it was somewhat difficult at times, is being able to come up to speed with that information. Another one is verbose versus brevity. So define the two. Verbose is this idea, again, it's very much details about everything around handover communications and what's occurring with the current situation. There might be multiple incidents that are going on, so you want to be as detailed as possible. And the brevity is the idea that it's less detailed, shorthand, short, quick bits of information, but it's not always there. So then engineers felt during this that their confidence in the handover is determined by how verbose it is, something to keep in mind as we look into more. So let's hear from an engineer regarding verbose versus brevity of handovers. So it would be the brevity of it would be the biggest summary of what makes the handover lousy. Basically, when it's missing what the customer impact is and what I need to be keeping an eye out for. So that's another perspective from an engineer, from the research, about verbose and brevity of an actual handover communication. Preparedness for the handover. Balancing blended responsibilities with high workload demand. I'm sure we could all raise our hands, and this happens every single day that we're in, especially in tech or any other industry we're in, that we're trying to balance multiple things. And preparing for a handover, along with many other responsibilities, as we all tend to have, to balance the engineers, felt this to be difficult and can add an extra layer of complexity. So it really comes down to multitasking when you're preparing for a handover is really not your friend. And so preparing for a handover needs your full attention to focus on it and make sure we get all the detailed information for the incoming engineer. Informal artifact gathering. So engineers, during this time in the research, they were gathering artifacts and notes throughout their day to then even communicate with them with the most up-to-date information that is available at the time. So that was the key to how they gathered all those artifacts. But it's interesting to hear what an engineer has to say about this. And it's quite, I'm just baffled by it, but I feel like it's very interesting to folks. And you may have this set up at your home or at your place of work as well. As for every incident, I have a set of virtual desktops. I basically have 4 full monitors dedicated to it. One of the windows I have dedicated on each of those is that form that I just keep filled out and up to date of this handoff, so I prepare for it. So as the day goes on, if there's major changes in it, if I do any postings, I fill it out, and I update it, and I delete the parts that are no longer relevant right for the incident, or right for the handover. So that's kind of the interesting piece from a preparedness for a handover that an engineer had about the handover communication prior to it actually happening. That's a lot. That person's got a lot going on. Guidance for handover communications. Formal handover templates. I know we like our templates. We got postmortem templates. We got all these templates. And I get it. I completely understand it. So, but from the analysis and the formal templates, They have their drawbacks, and they have a benefit. So one drawback that I'll draw from is the thought that all the information is supplied as part of that template a person ships over to the incoming engineer just isn't true. It might be even out of date, or there might not be enough information in it. But the other benefit that some folks said during this, the engineers said during this conversations, is having some predefined sections for guidance and just some basic info is helpful, so it triggers some of the write-up, but then free texting it is much better. So it's kind of a balance between the two with formal handover templates. Next one is limited processes and requirements. So during the research and the conversations, this came up multiple times in the interviews, is there was minimal guidance, and I heard this a lot, provided for each department on what information was needed for the handover. Really, to note, there was just no general overarching guidance available for each department or for all of the company around how to do their handover communications. It was really like, do your own thing, whatever works, that type of thing. So we're going to close the loop. Acknowledgement of the handover. So this is the idea from the interviews. It depended on how the engineer interpreted how engaged they both were with the incoming and outgoing engineer with the handover. So this kind of led to the whole common ground breakdown between the parties. So the idea is that acknowledging the handover is important, but then it also could look at, like, if you didn't acknowledge it, it was unsatisfactory, or if it was acknowledged, it was satisfactory. That's kind of the interpretation and subjectivity that the engineers gave. But the whole idea was, if you have common ground breakdown, is the idea that you think the other person's there on the other end, but if they don't acknowledge, then you feel like it's going to be unsatisfactory at the time. And I know that seems obvious, but it wasn't when you kind of bring this forth to engineers. Availability after the handover. So maintaining availability after the handover by the outgoing engineer gave the incoming engineer the ability to ask questions and, again, gain more context. The question really is to the room is, do you, in your handovers, you're the outgoing engineer, do you hang back for 5 to 15 minutes to have a conversation or get on a quick Zoom to have a chat to see if they got all the information they need, if they read it? Or do you have that verbal connectivity? We'll get into that a little bit more, but yeah. That's kind of something to think about availability after the handover. It's something they did at NASA, but they did it for an hour. I don't think we need an hour, but it's something to think about. Let's review what an engineer has to say about availability after handover. So it's so close to the end of a shift for posting this out, and then, okay, I'm out, and I do this myself, but you don't even have that opportunity to ask them any questions. So it's more this lack of any opportunity to follow up and poke and prod, to ask more questions. I don't necessarily think we need a lot of time. This engineer is even saying, I don't need 5 or 10 minutes before heading out. I think that would probably give me enough time to actually get more context about what current situations are going on within the incident or incidents. So something to consider. I think this is an important one. So here's a theme recap. So organizational context of handover communications, evolving handover communications, information exchange, preparedness for the handover, guidance for handover communications, and closing the loop are all the themes that emerge from this analysis and doing this research within the organization that I did it at. So next, we're going to put it all together. We kind of heard that from the last presentation, putting it all together. So now we have the themes emerge. So what did we learn and how it relates to what can decrease or increase confidence after a handover? So what can decrease confidence? Ooh, we don't want that, but these things can happen. Inconsistency among the departments of what information is needed. I know we kind of talked about that before, but this is the idea that not all the information is there. So when you have inconsistencies, engineers did not feel like they were confident in the actual handover communication that occurred. No availability at the handover. I just spoke to this one. Task questions or gain more context. Again, having that availability, building in that availability time, 5 to 10 minutes after the handover, 15 if you want more, to actually have that conversation would be great. Balancing responsibilities while preparing for the handover may result in reduced information. Your context switching and things like that, that's kind of the whole idea around high workload can lead to less information. So it's something to consider is, do you give your engineers time in your handover situations, time to actually build up and prepare for the handover? Or is it just more, check the box, I rubber stamped it, it's good to go? Formal templates can lack vital information. There is some benefits, but I would put it as a decrease because from the engineer's perspective and the difficulties they told me about, the template didn't do as much as far as giving the information they need. They'd rather have some more conversation about it and less template and more free texting. And further exploration for information right after the handover. So the idea is while our engineers have, I have to go on this one too, while the engineers have the capacity there to adapt after the handover and let's say the outgoing engineer leaves, they still felt the information I get was, that's great, and I think we do that well as people, but they didn't feel like if they have to further explore right after the handover and there's nobody there to actually have a conversation with, availability after the handover, then they felt like, that really decreased my confidence with the actual handover and the information I got. So that was a big thing written out of it from this. So what can increase confidence? We're kind of ending it on a good note. Verbal handovers need to be in support of digitally written handovers. So the question is, if you have either or, do you actually do both? There was actually one paper I found that actually one industry did this. And so with that, do you do verbal handovers and then you have something written, or do you do digitally written handovers and then you actually jump on a Zoom to have more conversation? Detailed handovers, whether verbal or digitally written, are of the utmost importance. I mean, after getting through all of what I've talked about, it's probably self-explanatory now. But it's key to kind of talk about it, what can increase that confidence for the engineer, is writing out detailed handovers, giving the time to do it. Creating an embedded workflow or process for the handover can help reduce context switching. So this kind of talked about the journey from the continuous improvement piece. It's really coming down to embedding that workflow and not having the engineer having to context switch over to, I've seen where context switching goes to, I got to go to WikiConfluence and update it and get ready for the handover here, and then I've got to go back to Slack, and then I've got Google Sheets, and then I've got all these other things. And so it's nice to have an embedded workflow, i.e. Slack workflow or something custom built, so they don't have to context switch and transverse off so they're actually watching, because a lot of companies I think use various things like Slack today for their incident management and incident response and network operations and customer support. They all do that there. So it might be a nice added tool to use, or Microsoft Teams, whatever you use. But keeping it embedded is key there. Guidance about what information to supply for each handover needs to be consistent across all departments. I mean, this is pretty important. So just having guidance. I'm not saying a policy. I'm not saying something you have to comply by. I'm saying guidance of what basic information an engineering team would need to give as part of a handover communications and what their roles and jobs and responsibilities are. It's just a guide. It's nothing more, nothing less. Acknowledging the handover is a must. So again, this is kind of like one story I can give you during the research was there was two engineers, one's incoming, one's outgoing, and what happened was the outgoing engineer hung on during a digital written communication Slack workflow, hung on for over 30 minutes waiting for the incoming engineer to actually acknowledge the message with a button. And waited and waited and waited, and finally the engineer called the other engineer on the phone, and that person came in and acknowledged it. And that's the thing with digitally written handover communications. It can be challenging at times because you don't know if that person's actually there. They remember to come in and acknowledge the handover. So it's kind of, that's why I go back to the first one, is like having both so you can actually have a conversation is beneficial. So final thoughts. It seems reasonable for the organization or other industries to actually test these key findings in the future. These key findings may help provide increased confidence for engineers after a handover. So the journey concludes. This is graduation at Lund in June of 2022. Sometimes you hear folks in the hallways around groups might talk about Smokes or Johan. Well, here they are after graduation. Smokes is on your left, Johan is on your right. And this is at one of their places in Lund, so it's kind of a great atmosphere there too as well. But yeah. So quick bits, there's a Twitter handle called Lund under HFS. If you go there, they have some great stuff they tweet out every now and then. Thesis for your weekends, videos, all the things you want to learn about human factors and safety science, which kind of led to a lot of the incident analysis. It's not all incident analysis, there's a lot more to it, but it's something you can tag onto and look for. And then here's my thesis. Sure, I can post it later, or somebody will post it, but yeah, this is there's more to it, getting a highlight here. So that ends it. If there's any questions for me, that would be great. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Chad.